All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Danielle Kuhn. I am the Director of Faith Formation at St. John the Baptist, and this is session 9 of our series on the Protestant Reformation. Tonight, we get to talk about Henry VIII and the English Reformation, which is going to be really different than the other Reformations that we've covered in the past because with Luther, with Zwingli, with Calvin, with the Anabaptists, all of them are very heavily focused on theology. The reason why they're breaking from the church is theological, to different degrees of soundness, correct? The English Reformation isn't really like that. The reason why Henry VIII breaks from the Catholic Church really has nothing to do with theology and everything to do with his desire for political stability and an heir. Hence, the English Reformation reads a little bit more historical. It's less a theological journey and more just, this is how history went, this is what the rulers wanted. It's a Reformation told a lot more singly through the lens of the monarchs. So we lack a little bit of theological discussion, but we make up for that with some really interesting political discussion about the English rulers during this time, who are fascinating and quite the characters. As a general disclaimer, before we get into everything, I don't have a PhD in history. I am not the foremost expert on the subject by any means, so I just love this topic, like talking about it, and have bamboozled you all into listening to me once a week. All right, with all of that said, let's begin our last class on the Protestant Reformation in terms of the Reformers. Next week, we start the Catholic response, which is huge and so big in understanding the church that we have today, the Catholic Church we have today. So, English Reformation. The English Reformation was influenced by a number of factors, but none more than the fact that the Reformation in England occurred at multiple levels. So, unlike other places like Switzerland or Germany, where everything was really kind of a grassroots movement. It started with the people, and then the rulers ended up having to deal with it, but it started with the people first, and rulers and reformers within clergy. The Reformation in England starts first at the monarch level, so with the rulers, and that Reformation, those movements, have to reckon with the fact that there also was already some reformers, reformed theology that had been coming into England and bubbling up with the peasantry, regular people, ordinary Joes. You know what I'm talking about. So from the top, you have a Reformation from monarchical authority, and from the bottom, you have a Reformation from supposed biblical authority. Henry VIII is going to be our initial figure, so let's get him on up here. Henry VIII, everyone. All right. And then we're going to eventually be tracing the Reformation through Edward VI, Queen Elizabeth I, Mary Tudor, a little bit of Edward Seymour, and then ending with King James I. Henry VIII, in 1521, very ironically, was given the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope for his defense of the sacramental nature of marriage and the authority of the Pope. So, 1521, Luther's 95 Theses came out. 1517, that hubbub is just starting, and King Henry VIII writes this beautiful statement about the sacramental nature of marriage, which is so poetic, and the authority of the Pope. Now, he didn't necessarily do this because he was motivated by strong religiosity, however. This was more done for political gain. He had a lot to gain in being against Luther. Luther threatened the stability of his country. Henry was seeing what was happening in the countries where Protestant movements were striking out against rulers, or rulers didn't know how to control them, and he was like, I want no part of that. Do not bring that to England. And then Henry VIII also wants to stay in good graces with Charles V, who is the Holy Roman Emperor during this time, and the Pope, because those are kind of power players. And he's like, if I'm going to throw my lot in with anybody, I'm sticking with Henry V and the Pope. This Luther guy, he's not a sure bet. I don't want to back his horse. So Henry spouts off all these beautiful words supporting, defending the Catholic Church. Again, not really motivated by religiosity at any point. For defending the sacrament of marriage and the esteemed place that marriage had among the sacraments, Henry was not the most faithful in marriage himself, right from the get-go. So the English Reformation and Henry's Reformation was really sparked by one problem that Henry was having. He really wanted a male heir. Henry is a Tudor from the Tudor line, and this was a family that only recently took power in England. They only took the throne in 1485, so their dynasty, so to speak, is a little bit shaky. They don't have centuries of lineage going back on the throne of England. And because of this, Henry really feels this pressure to make sure that his throne is secure. The Tudor line is secure. So he's very big on getting a son, especially after the bloody War of the Roses that came before this. He's desperate to solidify his family's grip on the throne. England also has never had a female monarch at this time, so maybe if Henry had come about after Queen Elizabeth I, who proved herself to be an amazing female monarch, not perfect by any means, but we'll get into her. So there's no precedent. He does not think it's going to work if he doesn't have a male heir. He marries Catherine of Aragon, who's the daughter of Queen Isabella of Castile. Have you ever heard of Ferdinand or Isabella? It really should have been Isabella and Ferdinand, because Isabella did way more than Ferdinand ever did. She is a very interesting character in her own right, but doesn't really have anything to do with this topic, other than Catherine was her daughter. And they got married in 1509. And although Catherine had 6 children in between 1509 and 1518, only one survived, and this was a daughter named Mary. Let's have a little bit of empathy for Catherine of Aragon in this moment. My heart is just wrenched at the thought of having 6 children over a period of 8 years and only one survives. 2 died in childbirth, and then 3 were miscarriages, and that is so difficult. She did not have an easy life. But so Henry VIII is freaking out. He's like, I need a son, and he petitions the Pope for an annulment. Now, I want to give Henry VIII a little tiny bit of credit here, because I think sometimes we think that Henry VIII's desire for an annulment was just really capricious, just like, I want an annulment now because I don't like her and she stinks. He did have some semblance of a reason for this annulment, and it gets a little complicated, but we're going to talk about it. So, originally, Catherine of Aragon was married to Arthur. Arthur was King Henry VIII's older brother, the firstborn son of King Henry VII. Arthur unfortunately died when he was 15, 6 months after he had married Catherine of Aragon. Both Catherine and Arthur were only 15 when they got married. And Catherine always staunchly held to the position that their marriage had never been consummated. And if a marriage is never consummated, then it's not valid. King Henry VII really wants to keep Catherine of Aragon's dowry, the money given to England by Spain with their daughter for the king marrying her. he really doesn't want to lose all that money, so he doesn't want to just send Catherine back after his son Arthur has died. So instead he's like, don't worry, she can still marry a king of England. She can marry Henry VIII. But it was against canon law for a brother to marry his widow. Some concerns there about brothers maybe killing off fellow brothers so that they can marry their wife. So if you wanted to marry your brother's widow, you had to petition the Pope. And the Pope in 1502 granted to Catherine of Aragon and King Henry VIII that it was fine. Catherine and Arthur's marriage had never been consummated. Henry and Catherine could get married, which they later do in 1509 once Henry VIII is 18 years old. So that's kind of the background going on there. Henry VIII thinks that because he never got a son, or has not yet gotten a son from Catherine in their 9 years of marriage, that his marriage must be cursed, and that the Pope, when he gave them papal dispensation to get married, even though she was his brother's widow, he must have made a bad decision. Like, that dispensation was invalid. So what King Henry VIII is doing is he is petitioning the Pope to give him an annulment with Catherine of Aragon and say that the Pope's earlier decision was invalid, and therefore King Henry's and Catherine's marriage now is invalid. That's the angle he's trying to come at this whole annulment from. So there is, just the tiniest slice of credit that we can give him. He's going to lose it real fast in all the future movements he makes. So the Pope has a lot going on. He gets King Henry VIII's request, but this is not a request that he can easily grant because of a number of things. First of all, it is a lose-lose situation for the Pope. If he grants King Henry VIII this dispensation and says that the earlier papal dispensation was invalid, he is hurting his own credibility and hurting his own authority as the Pope, because he's saying that the Pope made a mistake in saying they could get married. But if he doesn't give them this doesn't give them this annulment, then he is losing a huge ally that he has against this Luther guy who is running about creating dissent and division in the church. So the Pope is already in a tough position. That's made even more difficult, though, by the fact that, and we do not have time to get into it, but Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the one who supposedly is supposed to be really tight with the Pope, yeah, he had just sacked Rome, and all of his troops were around the city. European history, it's just messy, and that's why we love it. But so Charles V, who is a relative of Catherine of Aragon, Charles V was also Spanish. He's got Rome surrounded with armies. The Pope does not want to say anything that might make Charles V mad. So he is not going to say that Charles V's very nice female relative, Catherine of Aragon, is no longer the Queen of England. So he writes back to Henry and he's like, I'm sorry, I cannot give you this annulment. It's going to be a no for me. And Henry is very upset about this, because during this time that Henry is waiting, he falls in love with Anne Boleyn, which was a sister of one of his former mistresses. Again, though he wrote about the sacramental nature of marriage, King Henry VIII did not live this out in practice. He had many mistresses, much like a lot of monarchs during this time period. It can be sad if you look at the history of monarchs in general. Men and women, a lot of them don't seem to value the sacrament of marriage, and it's upsetting. Anyways, Anne Boleyn, sister of a former mistress of Henry VIII, and Henry VIII is obsessed with her at this point. It is more than just a fling. She's on a different level than his previous mistresses. He is completely head over heels, can't stop thinking about her, obsessive. Henry VIII kind of goes through these mood swings a lot. And sometimes you are the object of favor in those mood swings, like Anne Boleyn at first, but then he can have a really negative mood swing, and that's when your head gets chopped off. But for now, he's totally obsessed with Anne Boleyn, and he is really, really upset that he's not being granted his annulment. So what does he do? His advisors, many of whom are already influenced by Protestant Reformed theology, are like, mad at the Pope, do you say? Mad at the Catholic Church, do you say? Well, do I have a solution for you? Nowadays, there's another church that you can be a part of, or you can just break off and do your own church. So they tell Henry that he should break off and make the Church of England a whole nother branch of the government, basically, and make himself the head of that church. That way, he can have all the annulments he wants, because he's the one that grants himself that annulment. So he does. He breaks away from the authority of the Pope, declares himself the new head of the English Church, and that takes care of that. It works out very nicely, Henry thinks. This doesn't take place overnight. It occurs over a slow period of time between 1531 and 1533. But eventually, Henry completely detaches England from the authority of the Catholic Church and makes it a whole separate, different church. He secretly marries Anne Boleyn in January of 1533 and is granted an annulment by the new Archbishop of Canterbury, who is under the authority of King Henry, in May of 1533. So technically for like 5 months, he was married to Anne Boleyn before he had an annulment with Catherine of Aragon. To put into official law Henry's takeover, Parliament passes in 1534 the Act of Uniformity, which henceforth gave the king the sole power to appoint bishops, prosecute all heretics, be the sole owner of church property, and the manager of all church revenues. And man, does Henry exercise all of those powers. After 1534, all faithful Catholics who are still supporting the authority of the Pope are pronounced traitors deserving of death. Remember, as the monarch, King Henry VIII has the ultimate authority in prosecuting all heretics, and he does so with any and all who disagree with him. So, despite Henry's break from the Catholic Church, all of the theology, rituals, and ethics were really unchanged. Because Henry didn't care about that. He wasn't interested in changing any theology. That was not really important to him at all. The important thing was that the authority was changed. So, Pope is out, Henry is in. But the fact that he kept all the theology the same, the rituals, the vestments, really, all the theological elements the same, that really bothered a lot of the Protestant Reformed theology supporters who were in England at this time. They wanted Henry to go further. They wanted him to be, making the same kind of changes that Zwingli and Calvin did. So when he didn't, when all he did was take possession of church property and revenue, they were mad and they made a fuss about it. And if you were Catholic and you made a fuss, or if you were a Reformed Protestant and you made a fuss, Henry's response was the same. You're dead. You're a heretic. You're challenging my authority. Off with your head. And so there were a lot of martyrs on both sides. There were Protestant martyrs and there were Catholic martyrs dying for their faith. King Henry ended up doing a lot of executing. One of the first people who suffered King Henry's execution was, let me get rid of this guy here for a second, was St. Thomas More, who was actually a really close friend. I mean, he must not have been that good of a friend, but he was pretty close with King Henry VIII for the while, and Henry really respected his advice for a while until his advice was that he should not break away from the Catholic Church and he should submit to the authority of the Pope. So Thomas More is actually a saint, St. Thomas More, and he's well known for his writing and for sticking up for the church and saying, what you're doing, king, even though you are the king, is wrong. He was a very witty guy. He's quoted going to his death as saying, "Pluck up thy spirits, man, and be not afraid of thine office. My neck is very short." That's what he told his executioner right before he was beheaded. So, great saint. Good writer. Check him out. I support Thomas More. Okay. We're going to do a quick excursion here to cover all of King Henry's wives and then go back to the Reformation, because I just don't want to be like hopping back and forth between the wives and then the Reformation throughout the timeline. So let's bring out the ladies. Henry VIII had 6 wives. Most of them suffered unfortunate ends, all except Catherine Parr, who was his last wife, and the one on the bottom right. But we'll go through them briefly. So Anne Boleyn is the top middle. We have on the top left Catherine of Aragon, of course. So Anne Boleyn never does give birth to a boy. She only gives birth to one child, a daughter, who is Elizabeth, who will become very, very important. And by the way, Catherine of Aragon's single surviving daughter, Mary, is also very important. We'll be talking about her again. But Anne Boleyn only has one daughter. I mentioned before, Henry kind of had a lot of mood swings. Well, eventually he accuses Anne Boleyn of adultery. And he has a fit where he decides that she must be beheaded. So he kills Anne Boleyn, and Elizabeth has to be sent away to be raised up as a bastard child because he quickly declares his marriage with Anne Boleyn invalid and marries 2 weeks after he kills Anne Boleyn. 2 weeks afterwards, he marries Jane Seymour, who is the lovely lady on the top right. Jane Seymour was one of Anne's ladies in waiting. In September 1536, Jane does give birth to a baby boy, a very frail baby boy, who she names Edward VI. But unfortunately, Jane herself dies in childbirth, so that was sad for Jane. But at least she wasn't beheaded. So then Henry marries Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves is on the bottom left in our picture. But he had not actually met her when he agreed to marry her. And when he actually did see her, when she came over from Germany to meet him, he thought she was very ugly. And finding her unattractive, he said he was not going to marry her. So he just quickly got another annulment. Because he had actually married her, even though he hadn't seen her yet. It was a whole agreeing to things, contracts. But he gets another annulment because he doesn't think she's pretty. Which, I mean, look at her photo, bottom left. Anne of Cleves, that's a good photo. I've seen a lot of old-timey painting portraits, and that is a nice painting portrait. She could do a lot worse, and so could Henry VIII. Okay, so Anne of Cleves is out. And then he marries 19-year-old Catherine Howard, 16 days afterwards. So like a little bit longer than 2 weeks, but not really. 16 days, basically 2 weeks. He marries Catherine Howard, and she's middle bottom. I don't think her portrait really does her justice here. It's kind of like the most homely portrait of these photos, but Catherine Howard was really the it girl of the court. She was flirty and charming and beautiful, and all the boys wanted to talk to her, and that's why King Henry married her. Unfortunately, that's also why King Henry decided that she was too flirty and too pretty and drew the attention of too many other men at court. So within 18 months, Henry also had her beheaded for adultery in 1542. For both Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, most people would say there was no adultery. There's a little bit of historical, back and forth there. The general agreed upon notion is that Henry just had a lot of emotional outbursts and quickly would just accuse people of things and then behead you. So lastly, though, in 1543, he marries Catherine Parr, and we just need to have a round of applause for Catherine Parr. That woman put up with a lot. At this point, near the end of his life, King Henry was around 400 pounds. He had a leg ulcer, a wound from a jousting match that occurred earlier on in his life that never healed, so he couldn't really walk or move anywhere. And he had this wound that was always needing to be tended to. Kind of gross. And Catherine Parr took care of him. She nursed Henry as he declined, and she stayed with him, and she stayed alive, which is great for Catherine Parr. Henry died in January of 1547 at the age of 56, so he really didn't live that long. He was not in good health. And that's the story of all Henry VIII's wives. The last three, he did not get any male heirs from either. I don't know if he got any children from, definitely not Catherine Howard, maybe Catherine Parr. I don't think so, though. That's a blind spot for me. I'm not positive. So that's what happened with his wives. Back to the English Reformation. Now we return. Okay. As Henry's going about trying to find a marriage that will give him a male heir, the strong heir that he wants, he does continue to make religious changes in England. So he's tweaking things. And he's especially using the powers that he gave himself. So the power to control all church revenue and all church properties. He needs to get the support of the courtiers behind him. Some of the courtiers are kind of ambivalent Catholics. They're like, why should I be on your side? Convince me that you're the right horse to back. Some of his courtiers are Protestant Reformed Protestants, and they're like, I don't know if you're doing enough, Henry. You're not really, this doesn't seem like you're reforming things from a desire to have the right, pure religion. And Henry needs these men to be on his side if he wants to be successful in keeping the power of the Church of England. So what does he do? He shuts down all the convents and the monasteries. Some of them he sells off, but he confiscates all of their land and their wealth, and then he redistributes all that land and that money that he collected to all of his nobles in order to buy their favor. This is sad. This is very sad for me to think about from the standpoint of that's very heartbreaking for all the monasteries and the convents that were just shut down, the monks and the nuns just turned out of them. Politically speaking, I can respect that this was a very smart move for Henry. I'm not saying I support this at all, but it was a smart thing for him to do politically. Because it really strengthened the governmental nature of the English church now. The dukes and nobles are now very invested in keeping England away from union with the Pope. They don't want to have to give all this land and money back. It's nice when the Church of England is a branch of England's political system. You get perks, you get free land, you get free money. That's nice. So he not only gets their favor by doing this, but he gets them invested, because now they have something to lose if the Church of England reunites again with the Pope. All right, pardon me. Okay, but again, Henry is keeping all the theology and the practices the same. The vestments, the art, the inside of the churches, the practice of prayers, the Mass, all look the same as they did under the Catholic Church. The only change is one of authority. And you will really see this today if you go to an Anglican church. Now, the Church of England has branched off and broken off just like any Protestant denomination, such that it has a lot of different variations. You can have high church Anglicanism, which is it's very difficult to notice the difference between high church Anglicanism and Catholicism. Like, that's how similar they look in the Mass, in the style of their churches, and the vestments of the priest. And on the other hand, you can have like very liberal Episcopalians, which don't look at all like Catholicism, and definitely have super different theology than Catholicism. So the Church of England eventually has broken up into denominations that fall across the whole spectrum here. But when Henry first broke off from the Catholic Church, everything looked very, very similar, because he didn't really care about it looking different. He does, however, force all the priests and the bishops to swear loyalty to him, and those who refuse die. So, tough time for priests and bishops here. You definitely have a lot of priests who refuse, but you also have a lot of priests and bishops who do swear loyalty to the king. Like, I think it's almost more upsetting the amount that end up swearing loyalty than the amount that don't. Of course, it's so difficult because I'm not in their situation, my life is not being threatened, but it might speak to the condition of the church and the training of the priests and bishops at that time period if such a large percentage agreed to, like, oh, yep, okay, our new authority is the king, all right. It speaks to maybe some underlying corruption, some underlying notions of, oh yeah, my authority I just pledged to some other person, instead of understanding that your loyalty is always to Christ and to his church. Henry's religious moves really didn't make anyone happy among the people. Some people didn't care. Some people were just like, whatever, I just go to this church building on Sundays and they do whatever it is they do and I'm here. But there were a lot of people who were Protestants who didn't think he was going far enough, and then were Catholics who thought he was desecrating Catholicism. And he got a lot of dissent, and then a lot of cracking down on the dissent. A lot of Catholics and Protestants killed. Henry himself dies in 1547, and his son, Edward VI, inherits the throne. Now, Edward VI is 9 at this time, so he is not the most efficacious ruler. He cannot rule, basically. So instead of Edward VI, let me move him over here. Scooch over, Edward. We have a different Edward, Edward Seymour, related to Jane Seymour. Edward Seymour is the regent that is supposed to be taking care of things until Edward VI can come into power, i.e. isn't 9 anymore. And Edward Seymour is he's big, what is the word I'm thinking of? He's big on Reformed theology. He's much more sympathetic to Reformed Protestant causes. So he wants to change the church more. He pushes the Act of Uniformity, which compels all churches to use the Book of Common Prayer created by the Church of England. And this does change things. It takes away many of the ancient and traditional prayers, gets rid of litanies, changes a lot of things in the liturgy. It does keep prayers for the dead, though, so purgatory. It keeps language about the real presence of the Eucharist, and it keeps traditional vestments. So it's not that in-your-face different, but subtle changes are coming and kind of corroding at traditional theological Catholic practices. And then clerical marriage was allowed, so priests could get married now. In 1551, so Seymour has a rule of 4 years. Over here, this guy, 4 years. He is ousted by plots from other courtiers, and he's executed, having been accused of treason. There is a lot of power struggles during this time. The resulting new leadership was even stronger, though, in their push for reformed Protestant policies. So basically, the whole plan to get rid of Edward Seymour was just like, again, you're not moving fast enough. You're not doing enough to make England reformed, conform with reformed theology. That's a lot of the same sounding word. These new leaders were a group of leaders, and they created a new Book of Common Prayer for the Church of England that got rid of the prayers for the dead, got rid of the talk about the real presence, and got rid of vestments and altars. It's kind of hard to say how readily the people of England accepted these changes, because during this time period, if you didn't accept the changes, you were likely to be killed. So there's a lot of motivation for the common folk to just be silent. Don't make a fuss. In a place like Switzerland or Germany, where all the reformed efforts were happening bottom up, so they were happening among the people, you would have common people feel much more comfortable voicing their opinions, voicing dissent. But when the reform is happening from the leaders down, and the leaders have the right to persecute heretics, you have much more pressure to be silent. So it's kind of difficult to say how the people of England accepted these more extreme changes. But there were a lot of gruesome punishments that were doled out to rebels. Rebellions did not do well. Passivity, on the outside at least, seemed to win out. Yeah. Again, I think this speaks to the spirituality of England at the time. What was the status of the English Catholics as their country suddenly up and made such a drastic turn? What would it look like if our country did this now? If someone just, I don't know, an American cardinal uprooted the whole American Catholic Church and said, I'm the new head of the American Catholic Church. What would our dissent look like? Would we be passive as long as nothing exteriorly was changed? Things to think about. I don't know. In 1553, at the age of 15, finally, Edward gets to come onto the throne. So good job, Edward. You get to move over to the other corner. But quickly, Edward dies because he's always been very frail, not strong at all. So he dies without getting married and without having anyone to succeed him. And this is when the power struggles really get crazy. After a brief rule of 9 days by the Protestant Lady Jane Grey, relative of one of the wives, who was quickly ousted, Mary Tudor comes into the mix. Mary Tudor is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, so the first wife, the single daughter of the first wife. And Queen Mary is decidedly Catholic. She is the granddaughter of Queen Isabella of Spain, Mary is very Catholic, and she quickly goes about overturning all the reforms that were passed by Henry and Edward Seymour, and the people who later killed Edward Seymour, trying to put England back in line with the Pope and back in line with the Catholic Church. Queen Mary repeals the Act of Supremacy, the Act of Uniformity. She gets rid of the Book of Common Prayer that was written just for the Church of England. She restored the bishops that had been removed because they wouldn't swear loyalty to King Henry VIII. But Mary had a tough battle. Her policies did not make her popular in court. Remember, all the courtiers were very invested in not coming back into union with the church. They did not want to lose their nice land and money that they had gotten from separating from the church. So Mary is not popular. It's not fun to have their queen demand that they give the money and land back. They do not love it. In addition, she does two things that make her really unpopular with the people. One, she marries Philip II of Spain. And it's hard for us to understand why that was so unpopular now, but at the time, Philip II of Spain, he's connected to the Habsburg Empire, and the Habsburgs, which were kind of a Holy Roman Empire, Austria, Germany, Spain, they're kind of all over the place. They just infiltrate all of Europe. But they are enemies of England. England does not like the Habsburgs at all, so when Queen Mary decides to marry Philip II, the people are fuming. They're like, how could you do this? How could you betray England like this? We hate you. We hate you, Mary. So they don't like that. And then also, Mary persecuted a lot of Protestants as heretics. For all the executing that King Henry does, Mary does a fair amount of executing as well. She kills about 300 Protestants. And while that's actually a little less in number than all the Catholics that were killed during the time the Protestant rulers were in power, Mary killed that many over only a 5-year span. The Catholics were a lot more spread out with how they were killed. They were spread out over like a 14-year span. So it didn't look as uncouth. It wasn't as distasteful. But people seeing Mary kill all these people, and she was a woman killing people, it's just a bad look, the people of England thought. Mary also was not as charming as maybe she could have been. She just wasn't as adept at politics as, say, the next ruler, Elizabeth, is. Mary, she's very blunt, doesn't really put on any airs. She just says what she thinks, and a lot of people don't like that about Mary. So she becomes really unpopular, called Bloody Mary. So the deaths all served to create outrage against Mary, and Protestants were written of as martyrs, strengthening Protestant resolve and really hardening hearts against Mary. She's painted as this cruel, heartless woman, with no real faith, which isn't really fair. Mary gets a bad rap. She just kind of made a bunch of blundering mistakes that really hurt her public image. She's not remembered well. If Mary's reign had lasted longer, England might indeed eventually have gone back to Catholicism, but Mary died of natural causes at only 42 years of age, and her Protestant cousin Elizabeth then ascends the throne. Elizabeth reverses again all of Mary's policies. Elizabeth, unlike Mary, was a master politician. I read a biography on her. Forget who wrote it, but it was fascinating to read more about her personality and how she kept people on their toes, and how she really did a great job of keeping people from seeing what she was really thinking. She knew how to play the room. She knew how to win people over. She was really good at power plays too. she's just a very impressive woman for being not the first female monarch, because Queen Mary was the first female monarch of England, but I don't know, the first successful female monarch, and she was amazingly successful. So Elizabeth, master politician. Though she took the throne at 25, she never actually married. And this is one thing that I found fascinating about her. Throughout her life, she knows she's in a powerful position. Everyone's vying for her hand in marriage. Even as she gets up into her upper 30s, people want to marry her because she's so powerful. And she always keeps people on their toes. She would accept a proposal and then later be like, oh, no, I changed my mind. She'd invite people, like suitors, over to England so she could visit with them, like, I'm kind of considering you, maybe. Why don't you come see me? And then they'd come see her and she'd be like, oh, it's too soon. I don't know. I'm overwhelmed. Go back to your homeland. I'll decide later. So she never said no officially. She never said, I'm never going to get married ever. She always kept people interested, always kept people wanting, but then also never agreed to marry anyone, which is kind of understandable, because the minute Queen Elizabeth married someone, a lot of her power would have been diminished. And she wouldn't have had as much autonomy and control. So I respect that, Queen Elizabeth. Although I disagree with some of the other things you did, you were a very impressive ruler and a very impressive woman, and we applaud you. We applaud you, Queen Elizabeth. All right. And also, by not marrying, she kept her country from getting involved in deeper religious conflicts. So Elizabeth is Protestant. She grew up Protestant. Her mother was Protestant. But she is very conservative in her judgments and going either way. Just like with the marriage proposals, she's trying to keep people interested without making any official decision. She kind of does that same thing with the Catholic Protestant discussion. She is Protestant, so she's appealing to the Protestants, but her version of Protestantism looks awfully Catholic, because she also doesn't want to push the Catholics too far. So she's very astute and political in how she navigates her religious declarations, because what she doesn't want to do is end up like Mary, who people saw as a fanatic and crazy and bloodthirsty and cruel and so rigid that she had no compassion. Elizabeth did not want to be that. So in her religious reforms, Elizabeth takes a middle-of-the-road approach. She kept many traditional outward aspects of Catholicism, but did not require loyalty to the Church of England, and she did not require the use of the Book of Common Prayer. She also had many sections of the Book of Common Prayer deliberately rewritten so that they were vague about divisive theological issues, which I think this is so smart on Elizabeth's side. Do you want to offend no one? Do you want to say a lot of things without really saying anything? Just take a divisive theological issue and write about it in such a vague, non-committal way that you say a lot about that issue and absolutely nothing at the same time. This was Elizabeth's approach. She was not like Zwingli or Calvin, who were reformers who wanted to be super clear and thought it was super important to get the theology right. Elizabeth doesn't really care about the theology. She's really more a politician. So she's deliberately clouding the theology and making people read into it what they want to read into it, so that no one gets offended and angry and causes a ruckus. So this did bother, of course, the hardcore Protestants and the hardcore Catholics, but for the majority of people, it kept the peace. On the Protestant side, those who strongly condemned Elizabeth for not going far enough reform-wise began to call themselves the Puritans, because they were the only ones sticking to the pure form of Protestantism. And they were of the Reformed Protestant tradition that came from Switzerland. So those guys came from Switzerland to England, didn't think England was being Protestant enough, and then called themselves the Puritans and proceeded to make a ruckus. Later, after being persecuted by the Church of England for making the ruckus, and because they denied the authority of the monarch, the Puritans would be among the first group to travel to the Americas to settle a colony of their own for the purpose of religious freedom. In 1570, the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth from the Catholic Church and further said that no Catholic had an obligation to follow her. This move was meant to bolster the confidence of Catholics. It did actually end up contributing to their persecution, because this is how Elizabeth saw it. She's like, Pope, did you really have to excommunicate me? I don't care about being a Catholic. I don't care about my stance with the church. But now that you've excommunicated me and said that my Catholic subjects don't have to follow me, I now have to deal with them as a problem. So she totally thinks about this as a politician. She doesn't care about the theology or where she stands with the Pope. She just cares about the fact that now she's going to have a segment of her subjects who possibly get uppity or think that they no longer have any obligation to follow her authority. So now that she sees them as a threat, Catholic citizens as a threat, because they didn't believe in Elizabeth's right to be queen, Elizabeth does begin persecuting them with renewed vigor. She didn't want to, but she thought at that point that she didn't have any other choice because they did not support her authority as queen, and she was all about doing what she needed to do to consolidate her authority and protect her power. So Catholics were all required to abandon their faith, swear allegiance to the Church of England, or be killed. This led to priests and Catholics going into hiding. I think it's in James Bond Skyfall. At the end of the movie, James Bond goes through this underground tunnel that pops out in another place, and they talk about it being a priest tunnel where the Catholic priests would hide. I think that's connected to this time period, because there were a bunch of little hiding spots for priests like that and for Catholics in underground little tunnels or holes or the cellars of houses where if there was a raid or you were suspected of being Catholic or not swearing your allegiance, the Catholics would hide in the little hole or tunnel. In Wales and Scotland, we are going to touch briefly on Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Not too in-depth though. In Wales and Scotland, there was not too much resistance to the English Reformation. They were kind of just like, sure, fine, whatever you say. Scotland did become the starting place for modern Presbyterianism. A man named John Knox, Knox, was really the one who got Presbyterianism started in Scotland. He brought over Calvinism, though. So Presbyterianism is founded on the theological beliefs and system of Calvinism. In Ireland, however, the people really did not like England telling them what they needed to do or what they had to believe or who they now had to swear allegiance to. Ireland just never likes England telling them to do anything. So there was lots of resistance in Ireland. Everybody remained Catholic and loyal to the Pope. Lots of that was because they were a very Catholic country. Lots of that was just because they wanted to stick it to the rulers in England. And they're like, oh, you don't like the Pope? You want us to break from the Pope? We are going to be the Pope's biggest supporters. We are never going to leave the Pope. So deal with it, England. Ireland stays very Catholic, which we can see to this day. Go Ireland. Keep being a beacon. Stay Catholic, please. The Protestant Reformation had a huge effect on the 17th century establishment of colonies in America. We grow up being taught this, right? People came to America seeking religious freedom, religious tolerance. What they want is to get out of the chaos and the bickering rulers who are over in Europe using the Reformation as an opportunity to consolidate or gain more power, and who are squabbling. And from the different countries that got really restrictive, persecuted people, whether they were Protestants or whether they were Catholics. And that really sparked the desire for religious freedom, the desire to not have to hide in a tunnel for being Catholic, or worry about being beheaded for the religion that you were. You have Catholics seeking respite from England who settle in Maryland, Puritans who want to get away from England who come to around Massachusetts. Another group that broke from the Church of England that we don't usually think about are the Baptists. You think that the Baptists would come from the Anabaptists, but they did not. The Baptists that we think of today in America came to America and were led by John Smith, although that's Smith with a Y and not with an I, Smyth. They broke away in around 1609, I want to say. Yeah, 1609, and they came to America. You also had the Quakers, who broke away from the Church of England and settled in Pennsylvania. The Anabaptists, so often disliked by rulers in mainland Europe, came over and created multiple settlements in New York, in the New World. Settlements like New York and Rhode Island were explicitly marketed as places for people who were fleeing religious persecution. And they may have had a lot more trouble getting settled if it weren't for the persecutions going on in England. All of this is really interesting to think about. The fact that there were so many denominations already within, a period of 50, 70 years since Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses. So much fighting over doctrine and how you should live and how you should act if your ruler wasn't of the religion that you agreed with, the denomination that you agreed with. It really spurred the settlement of the New World. And I think America might look very, very different if the Protestant Reformation had not happened. I say that in a neutral way. I'm not saying, oh, that's a reason that the Protestant Reformation was really, really positive. I'm so glad it happened because America's been settled this way. And I'm also not saying that oh my gosh, if only the Protestant Reformation hadn't happened, America could have been settled differently. But it does make you think, if you didn't have all these Christian denominations coming for religious freedom purposes to the New World, would it have looked a lot more like other areas that were really only settled by missionaries and merchants? I think of Africa or India or Japan, where when the whole world was just Catholic, you just had missionaries and merchants reaching out to those countries. How would America look if the only people coming over were missionaries and merchants? I don't know. Maybe it would look a lot worse. Maybe it would look a lot better. I definitely wouldn't be here though, so I feel like I'm very biased. I support history happening kind of the way it did because otherwise I wouldn't be here. I don't know. That's a tough topic to think about. It's a tough topic to speak on. And we're not going to get into it. But I just think it's an interesting question. If the Protestant Reformation hadn't happened, what would the settlement of the Americas have looked like? Would there have been a settlement of the Americas? Maybe there wouldn't have been at all. All right, that is all I have for the English Reformation. That is all I have for the different reformers in the Protestant Reformation. For the last 3 classes in August, we talk about the Catholic response, which is huge in understanding why our Catholic Church looks the way that it does today. Just a lot of big things came from the Council of Trent. It's very important, and I'm excited to talk about it. Look forward to seeing you guys next week. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you guys have a fantastic Tuesday, and have a good evening. Bye.